Hello and welcome to this Christian Science lecture, sponsored by 3 Christian Science groups in the Southern California area, just north of LA. It's the Christian Science Society in Ojai, the Christian Science Society in Solvang, and the Second Church of Christ Scientist, Ventura. A big thank you to that group for working together collaboratively to bring this message today. My name is Phillip Hockley, and I'll be your lecturer today. The title of the lecture is A New View of God and Its Effect on Well-Being. And normally when I'm starting these lectures, I would describe how we might be able to use these new view of Gods, not just for ourselves, but in the way that we pray about issues going on in our community or in the world at large. But just recently, there are so many things coming up in the news that need our prayers. Only recently coming out of those 2 years of pandemic, then we hear the tragedy going on in Ukraine, then we've had the school shootings, and now we're starting to hear of fires, wildfires breaking out. I mean, there just seems to be a laundry list of things that need addressing at the moment. And what I found through my study of Christian Science is that whenever you get a big laundry list of problems, sometimes just one good quality solution can bring everything back to its original state. And I'm hoping that some of the ideas I'll share with you today will offer you such a solution for you to see a way through this list of challenges that we're facing. When I first started traveling giving this lecture, I would always introduce it by showing that I came to a lecture just like this 20 years ago, but I was a disabled person. This was my first ever contact with Christian Science, in fact, and at the time, the disabilities that I was facing were quite significant. I'd had an episode of arthritis as a child, which left me with one leg shorter than the other. This was called a leg length discrepancy. This in turn led my spine to curve in one direction, called a scoliosis, and because my spine was curved in one direction, my neck curved in the opposite direction to keep my eyes level. This meant that my neck would sometimes slip and dislocate very painfully for weeks at a time. So at the time of the lecture, I was often wearing one of those neck braces to hold my head up. So these were the structural problems that I was facing at the time. But by far the most serious problem was my weight loss issues, because for over 7 years, I had been unable to digest and absorb normal food ingredients as a result of multiple food allergies. This meant that my usual body weight before the lecture was about 185 pounds. At the time of the lecture, I was 105 pounds. So this was by far the most serious challenge that I was facing. When the doctors said there was nothing more they could do for me and they labelled me as permanently physically handicapped, I didn't take that lying down. I actually rose in rebellion, in fact, and I went and sought out what was known as the alternative therapies in those days. The A to Z, from acupuncture all the way through to zone therapy and everything in between, in fact. I exhausted them all. Nothing helped me. Then, in my sheer desperation, I even reached out to the local Christian churches in my community. Now, I say sheer desperation on purpose because up until that time in my life, I had been a lifelong atheist based on a very painful experience that us young children had at the hands of people in my village who called themselves Christians. And ever since that painful experience, if somebody described themselves as being a Christian, my natural reaction would be to back off. Now though, I'm facing what looks like an early grave, I thought I'd give them a go. They all prayed for me in their different ways, and still nothing helped. So it now looks like I've got no other option but to try and prepare to accept dying in my mid-30s. A friend of mine introduced me to a mindfulness technique which offers the promise of learning to die at peace. And so I thought I'd give it a go, and that mindfulness allowed me to basically feel all of the pain and the breaking down of the body, but mentally I was able to remain detached from it, and so I did feel an increasing sense of peace. So that was quite helpful. So that was the condition I was on, that's the condition I was in, on the night of that lecture. I came to the venue with short, painful shuffling footsteps. I was bowed over and breathless. I got to the front seat and I sat down, and I'm just using that mindfulness technique to not react to all the pain and inflammation from the short walk to the venue. When everybody started to clap, the lecturer had walked out on stage, and within moments of her opening her mouth, my heart sank, because she said that that night's events were going to be based on God's great love for all mankind as found in the Bible. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, they're Christians. Now I wished I hadn't made the painful effort to get to the venue. And then she started reading from the Bible, and things did not get any better, I must say. She read from the first book in the Bible, Genesis. This is what she read. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Really, I was thinking to myself, this is all very good, yes, that I'm in my mid-30s and I'm not likely to make it into my 40s. I'd been in pain and discomfort for almost a decade, day and night, and this lady wants me to accept that God sees all of this and it's all very good. Well, this started to make me think that my earlier opinion of Christians as being completely out of touch with reality was now quite accurate. So now I've got no interest in anything else this lady might have to say. In fact, I'm starting to plot my exit strategy, knowing that I'd have to wait about 10 or 15 minutes for all the swelling to go down, but then I was going to be leaving the building as soon as I could. So I'm not interested in anything else to do with this event, or so I thought. Because within just a few more moments, I heard some more words, and again, they really grabbed my attention, and again, not in a good way. And these words came from this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by an American lady, Mary Baker Eddy. Now, if you've never heard of this book before, it's not a problem, because on the night of that lecture, I had never heard of this book before either. However, the ideas contained within it had a life-changing effect on me. So if you'll just bear with me a moment, I'll share with you those ideas that I found so controversial when I first heard them. God is at once the center and circumference of being. God is at once the center and circumference of being, I thought, remembering now that I'd been passing my awareness through what I understood at the time to be my center, which is here, and my circumference, which was around the edges, and everything contained within this was full of disease and deformity, as confirmed by the doctors and my own painful experience. And this lady wants me to accept that God is the center and circumference of all of this suffering. Now I became enraged. My human thinking was full of anger and ill will and judgment. I couldn't accept any of this. And while I was in this agitated state, something else grabbed my attention, but this time in a really good way. And this is how it played out. I was sitting there completely annoyed at everything I had just heard in the first few minutes of this lecture. I've got no interest in anything they have to say now. I'm trying to leave the venue as soon as all the swelling and the inflammation goes down. And while I'm in this agitated state, my mind started to experience something akin to an opening up, like if you took a roof off a building. For instance, today I'm in a room with 4 walls and a ceiling, and it's a clear blue sunny day. If I were to lift the roof off this building, the difference between the space contained within this room and the space above this room would be remarkable, wouldn't it? Well, in my thinking at the time of that lecture, it felt like my human mind was full of this anger and ill will, but something started to open up into a larger sense of consciousness than I had ever experienced before in my life. And I noticed an incredible sense of feeling peaceful. Then I noticed an increasing sense of feeling loved. Now, this love that I was feeling, it wasn't like any love that had been freely exchanged with me by loving family or loving friends, girlfriends, none of that. This felt like a love that was actually pressing in on me. When I was asked to describe it a couple of days after the event, I used the term oceanic because it reminded me of an experience of when I'd learned to scuba dive years earlier. The deeper I went down into the ocean, the more you could feel the press of that water pressure on every square inch of your body. That's how that love felt on the night of that lecture. It felt like it was pressing in on me. And so while I'm experiencing this incredible experience, the thought came to me, don't forget to pass your awareness through the body and don't react. So that's what I did. I went back to that mindfulness technique, and as I started passing my awareness through the body, the next remarkable thing appeared. All the pain, the stiffness, and the inflammation that I'd brought with me to the lecture, it was slowly softening, then loosening, and then eventually just evaporating right before my very eyes. Literally the way that an ice cube would respond if you took it from a freezer compartment and placed it on a warm sunny windowsill. The first thing you'd notice is the ice cube has sharp angles and edges. They would start to soften. Then it would become a puddle and eventually the whole thing would evaporate, yes? That's the nature of an ice cube, isn't it, on a warm sunny windowsill. As I was passing my awareness through the body, all of that stiffness and pain and inflammation was softening and loosening, and it eventually just evaporated right before my very eyes. And I found myself sitting there in that lecture in a completely sensationless body for the first time in my life. And I was so amazed by what was going on, I didn't realize until people started clapping that the hour had finished, and I hadn't listened to a blessed word she'd said. In fact, I was so confused by what had just gone on, I wanted to leave the building as quickly as I could, with my eyes down, not to make eye contact and strike up a conversation with anybody in case I said something daft. So as I was leaving the building that night, they happened to have a table. They were giving away copies of Science and Health. Now, I know you haven't come to this venue today for this lecture. However, there will be contact details coming up at the end. If you want a copy of this book for yourself, we'd be happy to get one to you. I took a copy that night, not knowing why. However, in the days and weeks after that lecture, that little book, Science and Health, alongside the Bible, became an absolute rock, explaining to me in bite-sized chunks exactly what had gone on during that lecture. But first of all, I had to get home. Now remember, an hour earlier I'd come to the event as a disabled person. Now I'm leaving the venue, I'm taking long, effortless, pain-free strides. My head is held high, I'm breathing deeply, and in my confusion, I just mumbled under my breath, what on earth just happened back there? And to my amazement, as clear as a bell in my own thinking, I heard these words say, Philip, it's just like when you stopped believing in monsters under the bed. Now, I found that really puzzling because remember, at the time of the lecture, I was in my mid-30s. I hadn't believed in monsters under the bed since I was about 5. So this was really puzzling for me when I first heard it. But as I continued to walk home that night, some of the similarities started to dawn on me, and it worked out like this. I started to remember just those couple of painful months as a child. I just had this illogical fear that there was a monster living under the bed. And if there are any youngsters tuning in today to this, there never were any monsters under the bed. But I didn't know that at the time, okay? So I believed in them. So anyway, I used to wake up in the middle of the night, needing to go to the bathroom, too afraid to place my feet on the floor in case that monster grabbed hold of me. I'd end up sitting there and wetting myself. This went on night after night, week after week, until I developed a pretty bad case of diaper rash. The diaper rash was so bad, in fact, it was starting to show below my school shorts during the day. So the boys in school noticed this and they were bullying me and picking on me for being a big baby. My teachers weren't happy because my schoolwork was suffering. So the daytimes were not pleasant. The night times were pure terror. Every time I woke up in that darkened room, I felt this crushing grip of fear. until one very memorable night. I remember I woke up desperately needing to go to the bathroom, too afraid to place my feet on the floor again in case the monster grabbed me. I'm just about to accept, oh, here we go again, when I heard these words in my own thinking say, Philip, why don't you just look under the bed? And those words were so compelling and so compassionate, I didn't hesitate. I looked under the bed. What do you think I saw? No monster. That crushing grip of fear that had had me for those couple of months, it felt like it was released in that instant. You know, the same way that a dish sponge would operate when you squeeze a dish sponge and it's all distorted and out of shape, but when you release the grip, the dish sponge just pops back into shape, doesn't it? It literally felt like I just popped back into being the happy little chappie I'd been all along. I stepped down off the bed, I toddled off to the bathroom, and I came back and I slept soundly from that night on. Now, fast forward 30 years, I'm leaving my first ever contact with Christian Science at a lecture just like this. I came to the venue as a disabled person, and I'm leaving the venue completely free from those disabilities. And I really didn't understand anything that had gone on in there. And so I'm kind of asking, what on earth just happened back there? And the answer that I got was, it's just like when you stopped believing in monsters under the bed. As puzzling as that sounded when I first heard it, as I continued the walk home the night of the lecture, the similarities started to dawn on me. Because just like that little boy who had that crushing fear of that monster that wasn't real, this otherwise happy and healthy young sportsman had these crushing burdens laid on him as well. First of all, by being told that permanently handicapped, and then secondly, I was told if I didn't start absorbing food that year, I was probably going to die. These had become a crushing burden on this otherwise happy and healthy young man, but something had happened at that lecture which released that crushing burden, and I felt like I popped right back into shape, quite literally, because not only were my legs the same length and my spine was straight, my neck was free from that day to this, but the very next day I started eating and absorbing normal food ingredients. I regained those lost 80 pounds within 4 weeks of the lecture. No special diet, no special exercise. It's like I literally just popped back into shape. Now, you can imagine then that this atheist would have a lot of questions for that little church that sponsored that lecture all those years ago. So I made my way over to what's called the Christian Science reading room for that church. And again, there will be contact details at the end of the lecture. If you're interested in finding out about a Christian Science reading room in your area, reach out, we'll be happy to connect you. I was able to go to that Christian Science reading room and ask some questions of the clerk there. And I basically said, who was the lady mentioned in that lecture last night that I attended? Mary Baker Eddy. She gave me a few of Mrs. Eddy's biographies to choose from. I just picked one at random and I started reading about Mrs. Eddy's life story. I started to notice a couple of themes appear quite soon on into the story. First of all, I noticed that she was born in the early 1800s in the New England area into a deeply religious family. And this love of the scriptures remained with Mrs. Eddy throughout her life. I also noticed that she had many health problems as a young child, and these health challenges remained with her throughout most of her early life. She was very poorly and sometimes missed out on long periods of schooling, couldn't get involved in family activities, so she really was quite a sickly child. Then when Mrs. Eddy became a young adult, she experienced the joy of marrying, and while she's expecting a child, her husband tragically passes away, leaving her widowed, and with such a history of poor health, the family around her thought that she may not be well enough to look after the child properly, so her only child was taken from her. These were quite devastating challenges that I was reading about, and they started to make me feel a strange sense of compassion for this lady that I'd never met, because some of the challenges that she was facing, they reminded me of challenges my own grandmother had faced. And when Mrs. Eddy became a widow, they even reminded me of a challenge my own mother had faced. So now I'm in this kind of compassionate frame of mind while I'm reading about this lady that I've never met, when something happened in the next chapter of her life story which was a terrible turn for the worse. Mrs. Eddy slipped and injured herself on an icy pavement in the winter of 1866. She so badly injured herself that everybody in attendance, including a local medical doctor, were convinced that she would not recover from these injuries. Mrs. Eddy is now probably in the deepest, darkest period of a life that had been littered with challenges. Is it any surprise that she asked for a copy of her beloved Bible? No, she'd loved the Bible since early on in life. She says that she opened her Bible at random. The pages fell open to a healing account of somebody who was disabled, came in contact with Christ Jesus, and was healed immediately. Mrs. Eddy says there was nothing new about that. She'd read that Bible account of healing many times in her earlier Bible studies. But what was probably new about this situation is that Mrs. Eddy had never been in such a challenging, almost life-threatening situation where she was really yearning to feel some crumbs of comfort from her love of the Bible and the healing account of Jesus' healing ministry, when she said that she started to experience the presence of love in a way that it started to flood her consciousness until she found herself suddenly well. She literally rose up, dressed herself, and went into the next room and said, "I am well, and I now know how to make other people well." Mrs. Eddy then spent the next few years deeply searching the scriptures to see if there were any promises or laws of God that could explain this remarkable healing that she'd had. The end of those few years of scriptural study resulted in the first edition of Science and Health, with key to the scriptures. Now, Mrs. Eddy called it a key to the scriptures on purpose because she didn't invent any of this stuff that she was writing about. She actually found that all of it had its source in the Bible. And these are just some of the Bible promises and explanations that Mrs. Eddy was basing her writings on. This is from Hebrews. "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those, and in their minds will I write them." So that's a Bible-based promise. Mrs. Eddy, in her own words, she makes these comments. "I learned these truths in divine science, that all real being is in God, the divine mind, and that life, truth, and love are all powerful and ever present, that the opposite of truth, called error, sin, sickness, disease, death, is the false testimony of false material sense." Now, these material senses that Mrs. Eddy is referring to, they're the same 5 material senses that I'm using so readily today. You know, taste, touch, sight, sound, just the normal 5 material senses. Mrs. Eddy is here calling them false material senses. But then she goes on to introduce a concept, spiritual sense, and this is what she says about it. "Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God." Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant. Now, when I heard those words, the language that Mrs. Eddy was using, it reminded me of the same language that my physics teacher had used to introduce a concept when I was in high school about how radio waves worked. They basically said to us that the radio waves in that physics lab had been passing through every brick and beam of the building, but nobody was conscious of them. And I'll do the same for you today if you don't mind. While I've been talking, the whole time, in fact, radio waves have been passing through every brick and beam of this building, completely undetected by my 5 material senses, until I do this. So this now is proving to me that even though my 5 material senses are not conscious of this broadcast is here, isn't it? My physics teacher actually went a step further by burying the antenna completely in their fist and then switching the radio back on. So listen to this. These radio waves are now actually passing through every fibre of my body, completely undetected by my 5 material senses. So what this proved to me was this. Just because my 5 material senses are not conscious of something, it doesn't mean that that thing is not present, does it? It just means that I'm not conscious of it with my 5 material senses. Well, what Mrs. Eddy felt she discovered on that eventful night in 1866 is that she was able to experience a new view of God for herself, a view of God who is described in John as being love. Mrs. Eddy experienced that new view of God as that love that completely flooded her experience. She suddenly rose up well, transformed from that moment on. That new view of God, Mrs. Eddy now started to search the scriptures deeply to understand it more. And she was led to look into something she hadn't really fully understood before this healing, and this is the concept of the Christ. Now, she'd studied it many times, but hadn't really made the idea her own. Now she felt that she was starting to understand it better than she ever had. And again, she started her understanding based on Bible-based promises. So these are just a couple of the Bible-based promises that supported Mrs. Eddy's understanding. From Colossians, it says this: God would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And in Philippians, it even says that we can let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So these are the Bible-based promises that Mrs. Eddy was learning about and trying to apply, and she spoke about them in her own words. She speaks about the Christ in broadly 2 ways. She speaks about the Christ at the time of a physical healing, but she also talks about the way that the Christ appears in our daily thinking. So one example of at the time of a physical healing is this: Christ, the divine manifestation of God, which comes to the flesh to destroy incarnate error. Then, at the time of a physical healing, we've had that. Now I'll talk about how it appears in our daily thinking. Christ is the true idea voicing good, the divine message from God to men, speaking to the human consciousness. The divine message from God to men, speaking to our human consciousness. How could it do that, I thought? Was it because God had put those laws into our heart and our minds? Was it because we had a spiritual sense which is above the creation? As given in 1 Genesis, God made us in his image and likeness. So this concept of prayer was a really interesting subject for me to start studying and practicing. And it comes from the first chapter of Science and Health. It's called Prayer, but it's also taught regularly in what's called the Christian Science Quarterly Bible Lessons. Now, these Bible lessons, I thought, were a genius idea because you get a new subject to study each week. But the way that they study the subject was just so attractive. You get a couple of passages from the Bible first, then you get a couple of passages from Science and Health with key to those scriptures. So what I was getting was a little bit about the nature and quality of God, and then a little bit from Science and Health on how to apply those ideas about God's nature in practical ways in my daily life. And remember, I'd been a lifelong atheist. I'd never studied the Bible. So to get these Bible concepts in bite-sized chunks was just brilliant for me. So I'm really enjoying learning, first of all, a little bit about God from the Bible, and then how to apply that in my daily life. And each new week, we get a new subject to discover about the nature and quality of God. It was wonderful. But I kept running into some problems. And one of the problems was this: I could not understand this concept of reflection or image and likeness as given in 1st Genesis. God made man, women and children in his image and likeness. Because up until that point in my life, my only understanding of how an image and likeness works is the way that a mirror would work if I stood in front of one. And I'll give you an example today. If you imagine that there was a dress mirror across the room there, and I stood and faced it right now, because you can see I've got a checked short sleeve shirt, when I turn and face that mirror, you know full well, don't you, that my image and likeness is going to reflect back exactly the same checked short sleeve shirt, isn't it? If I turned and faced that mirror and I'm not wearing a hat, could my reflection reflect back me wearing a hat? No. It's impossible, isn't it? We've all seen this countless thousands of times in our own daily lives. So what I found so puzzling about this was the Bible lesson kept saying that God made us in his image and likeness. What I couldn't understand was I've got 3 brothers who are all different shapes and sizes to me. If God made all of us in his image and likeness, which one does God look like, I thought? Is it the tall guy or is it the small guy? It just didn't make any sense. So while I was wrestling with this idea one morning when the weekly Bible mentioned God made man in his image and likeness, and I'm thinking, I'll never get to the bottom of this, I heard these words grabbing my attention say, Philip, you're standing in the wrong place. You need to back up onto that mirror. You're my image and likeness. Now this really grabbed my attention. And figuratively speaking now, I saw myself as if I was backing up onto that mirror. And so now I'm thinking about myself as being on the mirror as the image and likeness. Of what? Well, I was told of God. And I'd already learned in my first few weeks of Bible studies that God was the spirit of life and truth and love. And as I was thinking about what God is, it started to dawn on me that if God didn't have arthritis all those years earlier, his image and likeness couldn't have had arthritis by reflection. If God didn't have one leg shorter than the other, which I couldn't imagine, his image and likeness couldn't have made one leg shorter than the other appear. This started to dawn on me that this is the way that healings happen in Christian Science, is when we exchange what we understand from what the 5 material senses is telling us, and then tune in, if you like, in prayer to what our spiritual sense can tell us. That spiritual sense, which is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. And as I was understanding more about the nature of God, I was actually understanding more about the nature of all mankind made in God's image and likeness. Because not only did this work for me personally and my healing need at the time of that lecture that healed me, it dawned on me that those neighbors in my village when I was a child who'd been so rough on us kids, if they were made in God's image and likeness, and I couldn't imagine God being a violent bully, those neighbors couldn't have really reflected violent bullying. Now, I dropped a 30-year resentment for those neighbors. That weight was lifted off my shoulders in that instant when I realized for myself that that is not true about God. It cannot be true about God's image and likeness. And I know this might sound like a trivial example of a young boy being bullied by some neighbors, but this actually has played out in other divisive and violent scenes that I've been introduced to as an adult. Because I've learned to pray this way in Christian Science by quietening my 5 material senses and tuning in with spiritual sense to see what God has to say about the situation. And the result has been remarkable. Sometimes they've been instant, sometimes the change has been gradual, but moving in that right direction has been tangible and noticeable. But this idea of reflection and image and likeness, we can apply it to all kinds of divisions. You take the political situation today that seems so full of rancor and discord. It doesn't matter whether you're on the blue side of a vote or a red side of a vote. God made all of us in his image and likeness. That means every man, woman and child in creation. So at some point, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. You think about the situation in Ukraine. It doesn't matter which side of a war somebody finds themselves. If God made every single one of us in his image and likeness, every single one of us must be able to experience that spiritually binding love, that brotherly and sisterly love that can only come from a spiritual sense. This has been so helpful to me in so many ways, and it was particularly helpful in the last pandemic that we had. Some of you may remember it was in 2009. There was the swine flu pandemic, and at the time I was working just down the road from you guys in the Los Angeles County Jail system. I was working there as a prison chaplain, and we would take in some weekly Bible materials and the Bible lessons. And this one particular week we got a phone call from the prison authorities saying, you don't have to come in because the prison is on a quarantined lockdown. Swine flu has appeared within the prison population. Now, the other prison chaplains and I, we were Christian Scientists. We'd learned to pray this way by quietening the 5 material senses and tuning in, if you like, with our spiritual sense to listen to the true idea, voicing good, the divine message from God to men, speaking to our human consciousness. We were practicing the fact that if we couldn't imagine God having swine flu, we couldn't accept it appear in his image and likeness. Now that meant us, the prison chaplains, but it also meant the prisoners and the prison officers. So we readily offered to continue going into the jail that week. We went in, we gave that weekly Bible lesson to probably 3 times as many men as usual, because the other prison volunteer services had stayed away for fear of that disease. Not only did we not see any signs nor symptoms of that disease while we were in the prison, we didn't see it in the prison officers, nor did we see it in ourselves in the days and weeks after we left that visit. Now, this wasn't based on wishful thinking or good luck. It was based on a rock-solid Bible promise. It comes from the 91st Psalm, and I've used it many times since then as well. This is what it says, in part. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in him will I trust. Because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High thy habitation, there shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. For he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. So that's not wishful thinking, is it? That's a Bible-based promise. And as I was learning more about how to study and practice this type of Christian Science prayer, the more I was finding that it can actually meet all the human needs that we're told about, that seem to be sometimes so troubling. And this has helped me confidently face all kinds of life's challenges since that first lecture I ever came to, because I know now that I can use my spiritual sense. I can tune in and listen to what God has to say about the situation, and oftentimes the result is healing. This was a very, very convincing experience for me about how present and practical the Bible promises were. A Bible which, up until that point, I thought it was just archaic mumbo-jumbo based on blind faith and, some kind of myth. Now I was starting to realize that there are tangible laws waiting for us to become conscious of them. Yes, just like the radio waves. If I don't switch the radio on, I'm not going to know what's being broadcast through this room. And what I was realizing in a similar way was, if I don't switch on my prayer, my spiritual sense, if you like, I may not know about the presence and the power of God and God's laws in my life. So while I was studying and really enjoying each new week's lesson, there was still one roadblock, it seemed, to my progress, because I could not work out what had happened to all those symptoms that had been with me for so many years that I brought to the lecture that night 20 years ago, and they all disappeared in that lecture. What had happened to them I couldn't understand logically, but guess where I found the answer? It came up in another week's Bible lesson. And again, it started with a Bible-based promise. It comes from a quote where Jesus is quoted as saying, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Now that's from John in the Bible. Now, the truth that Jesus was talking about there wasn't just a mundane truth like 2 + 2 = 4, although that's very practical and useful. Jesus was referring more to the spiritual truth of our spiritual identity, as given in 1 Genesis. God made every man, woman and child in God's image and likeness. Mrs. Eddy expanded on that in that week's lesson. She says this: consciousness constructs a better body when faith in matter has been conquered. Correct material belief by spiritual understanding, and spirit will form you anew. Let me just illustrate how this occurred to me, if you don't mind. Correct material belief. Now, this to me could be a symbol of what a material belief can look like. This is a strongly held material opinion of those medics, but it's not a spiritual law, is it? It's just a human belief. Mrs. Eddy is saying correct material belief by spiritual understanding, which I'm going to symbolize, if you don't mind, as this radio. This spiritual understanding or spiritual sense, which is above the 5 material senses. She says correct material belief by spiritual understanding, and spirit will form you anew. We can just pop back into shape, just like the dish sponge. And what shape is that? Well, how about 1 Genesis? God made every man, woman and child in God's image and likeness. Then Mrs. Eddy went even further. She asks this question, and it completely blew all of my doubts out of the water. She says this: if sickness is real, it belongs to immortality. If true, it is a part of truth. Would you attempt, with drugs or without, to destroy a quality or condition of truth? I'm just going to pause there, if you don't mind. Mrs. Eddy is basically saying if sickness is real, it's a part of truth. Can you change the truth? Now, for me, if something is true, it never changes. Like 2 + 2 = 4, it's a simple truth, right? Today, 2 + 2 = 4. That means I can confidently predict that in 1,000 years' time, 2 + 2 will still make 4. And I can confidently accept that 1,000 years ago, 2 + 2 was 4. Because this is what a truth looks like to me. It never changes, right? It's a constant. Mrs. Eddy says, if sickness is real, it's a part of truth. Can you change the truth with drugs? Now, I literally pictured this in my mind's eye, thinking, could I pour medicine over 2 + 2 and stop it making 4? No. Could I surgically operate on 2 + 2 and stop it making 4? No. Could I give it counselling and say, well, I don't mind if you want to be a 3 today or a 5 tomorrow? No. 2 + 2 is a fixed fact, isn't it? 2 + 2 = 4. It's never going to change. So Mrs. Eddy then goes on and says this: but, she says, if sickness and sin are illusions, the awakening from this mortal dream or illusion will bring us into health, holiness and immortality. This is the salvation which comes through God, the divine principle, love, as demonstrated by Jesus. That love that came from divine principle, Jesus understood his source of love to be infinite because it came from God. And Jesus was able to reflect that love as God's image and likeness into every situation that Jesus was called, and the result was often healing. This became a key, if you like, for me to really understand what happens at the time of what we call healing in Christian Science. Because at the time of a healing, I often feel a tremendous change where I feel a tremendous sense of ease, where for many, maybe months, sometimes many hours, many weeks, I might have felt a sense of dis-ease. And I feel a tremendous sense of comfort instead of what seemed to have been so much discomfort associated with the challenge that needed healing. This was something that I was so happy to start reading about, to start studying, to start listening to every Sunday when I came to the church services, where they read this Bible lesson every weekend. While that Bible lesson is going on upstairs in the church service, there are children learning these same lessons in Sunday school. And then on a Wednesday night, they have these remarkable Wednesday night testimony meetings. People in the community who've studied Christian Science this way, they will stand up and openly share with you testimonies of how they had faced all kinds of difficulties in their lives. They'd learned to pray this way in Christian Science by quietening the 5 material senses and tuning in with their spiritual sense. The result was healing. The church also has a couple of magazines. There's a monthly Christian Science journal and a weekly Christian Science Sentinel. Both of these magazines have been published for over 120 years, and every single edition dedicates a few pages to accounts of healing written in by people just like you and I, who came in contact with all kinds of difficulties in their lives, learned to pray this way in Christian Science, and the result was healing. This was a remarkable introduction for me to the practical efficacy of learning to pray this way in the modern age based on Bible-based promises. These Bible-based promises had always been there because they were laws. They were promised from everlasting to everlasting. They were prophesied. Then they were produced in the life and times of Christ Jesus. Then they seem to have been forgotten to human consciousness, maybe 1900 years, until Mrs. Eddy comes along and she discovers in 1866 that those laws, they're still fully present and fully operational, but they're waiting for us to become conscious of them. And how do we become conscious of them? Mrs. Eddy started teaching through her chapter on prayer. You quieten the 5 material senses, tune in with your spiritual sense. That spiritual sense, which is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. God whose laws were written in our hearts and our minds. Those laws that allow us to understand and accept the Christ, the true idea voicing good, the divine message from God to men, speaking to our human consciousness, every man, woman and child in creation. This was just fascinating for me, and more than anything, what really made it a sealer for me was the fact that they pray so willingly for other people in these churches. They pray for their communities, they pray for their world, and they share this information as freely as possible so that anybody can learn these same basic lessons that they can practice and study for themselves. They can learn to pray this way. They can learn to access their spiritual sense. They can start having this constant conscious capacity to understand God. And it was amazing. Now, it wouldn't have suited me if I would have found that there were any special rites or rituals you had to go through. No, I was looking for something that was unconditional. And you know how unconditional the laws in maths are. The laws in maths wouldn't care, would they, whether you were young or old or rich or poor or male or female. The laws of maths are everywhere present, just waiting for us to become conscious of them. The same with these radio waves. They don't care, young, old, male, female, rich or poor. Look, the radio waves just passing through every fibre of my body, look. Completely unconditionally, yes? This is what I loved about what I was discovering about Christian Science. And the way that it played out in a family drama was really conclusive, because my younger brother, who was not a Christian Scientist, he had a really bad fall one day on a mountain bike. I had come home for what we call the bank holiday weekend in Britain. It's the start of the Easter weekend. It was Good Friday. I came home for a family visit for that weekend, and as I was coming in through the front door, my brother was coming in through the back door. He had just fallen off his bike on the mountain behind the house, and his his arm was grossly disfigured, and he said, look, he said, I've broken my arm. I need to get to the hospital immediately. I said, okay, I'll take you to the hospital immediately. But would you like me to pray for that? I said, in Christian Science. If you'd seen his reaction, I may as well have just grown a second head, because he backed off and he went, no, no. He said, look at this. I don't want prayer, he said. I want anesthetic and surgery. Get me to the hospital. I said, okay, I'm taking you. I drove him to the hospital as soon as I could. The accident and emergency staff, they x-rayed him and they confirmed that it was a particularly bad break. Because it was so close to the elbow joint, they even said that you'll spend a few months longer than usual in plaster with this one. My brother's heart sinks because he knows he's got his final exams for his 4-year degree coming up in just a couple of weeks' time. The doctor said, you won't be writing with that hand in a couple of weeks' time. So my brother's heart sinks. Then the doctor delivered a body blow. He looked at his watch and he said, Mr. Hockley, it's now 9:30 p.m. on Good Friday. The fracture clinic is no longer here. They closed at 5 p.m. They won't be coming back in until 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning. So I can't put you in a plaster cast tonight, but what I can do, he said, I'll give you whopping great painkillers and I'll strap you very securely to your chest. You won't feel a thing. So while the doctor was writing out the prescription for those painkillers, my brother's colour started to drain when he realised that he's now going to have to sleep on an unprotected broken arm for 4 nights, knowing full well that he rolled around a lot in his sleep. So while the doctor was writing out that prescription, my brother started to look at me rather sheepishly and he said, hey Philip, is prayer still an option? He may as well have asked me if there were radio waves present. What do you think I said? I said, yes, prayer is still an option. As we drove home in the car, it's about a 15-minute drive back to the family home, I just described to him those first few early lessons I'd learned in Christian Science, how God made us in God's image and likeness. God was the spirit of life and truth and love and everywhere present, filling all space, and that we have a Christ in you, the hope of glory, that we can let that mind be in us. I was telling him these ideas and he was just nodding and nothing really changed. But when we got back to the family home, I said to him, so how does it feel to be made in God's image and likeness? He said, well, I don't know. He said, I know what an image and likeness looks like, he said. You know, if I stand in front of a mirror, I see my image and likeness. I said, no, that's the wrong view now. I said, God is making us in God's image and likeness. And I made him back up onto a mirror with me. And we were literally standing with our backs against the mirror this evening. And as we were standing there, I reminded him of what God was. Infinite life and truth and love as described in the Bible by those laws. And as my brother was thinking about this, you could see that his countenance started to shift. He started to loosen up and started to almost smile. He would look in front of himself, then he would glance down, then he would look up, and then he started saying, oh, he said, don't be so ridiculous, he said. God couldn't fall off a mountain bike, and God couldn't have a broken arm like this. That's ridiculous, he said, and he started laughing. He then took himself off to bed. Now, I didn't see him until the following morning at breakfast time. He marched into the family home, into the breakfast room, and he said this, look, he said, all the swelling is gone, and I'm in no pain, but I still want to go to that hospital appointment on Tuesday. I readily agreed to take him on Tuesday. And then I tidied up those loose bandages. Tuesday morning came along and I drove him to that appointment. The fracture clinic doctors rather wisely said that we'll take a fresh image today in case things have changed over the weekend. So the doctors x-rayed his arm, then they placed the x-ray up on one of those light boxes, you know, that they use the light box for the x-ray image. The doctor pointed to the image and he said, Mr. Hockley, he said, who told you you have a broken arm? My brother said, well, on Friday, accident and emergency x-rayed me. So the doctor now asks for Friday's image to be brought along. He puts 2 images up on his light box. He then points to Friday's image and said, look, he said, on Friday, I can see you had a broken arm. But what was the doctor seeing with? Wasn't he seeing with one of his 5 material senses. Now remember, I was there on Friday when my brother came into the house, and I could see with one of my 5 material senses the picture of a dreadful scene, a very disfigured arm. It was so shocking that I reverted to my spiritual sense in prayer immediately. And I basically said, Father, what do you see? And as clear as a bell, I heard these comforting words. I have not fallen today, neither has my image and likeness. Now, in that situation, those words were referring to my brother having not fallen, because my brother was God's image and likeness. I held on to those comforting words for the whole hospital visit on Friday night. Now on Tuesday, the doctor is saying, on Friday, I can see you had a broken arm, but today, he said, I can't see one. He said, can you stretch out your arm and do some tests for me? My brother stretched out his arm. The doctor said, any pain? My brother said, no. The doctor said, can you clench your fist back and forth without pain? My brother was able to clench his fist back and forth with no pain. The doctor said that that concludes for me, you don't have a broken arm. You're free to go. Now, we left that hospital rejoicing. Oh yes. And my brother did sit and pass his finals just a couple of weeks later using that very hand. But more than this, this experience became a pivotal moment in my brother's life. A changed man from that moment right up to the present day. Because of this, he described to me something which proved to me that he had a Bible-based new view of God for himself that had completely transformed his well-being. He said to me, he said, Philip, when we were in the hospital and the doctor said I couldn't have a hard plaster cast, he said, my stomach, he said, I felt like I was going to be sick. He said, I couldn't believe it, knowing that I would be rolling around in my sleep. I was terrified, he said. Then you made me think about what God is and how God made us in God's image and likeness. He said, it didn't really make sense to me until you made me do that image and likeness example on the mirror. He said, when you made me back up onto the mirror and I started thinking about what God was and what I must be as a reflection, he said, I couldn't imagine God having a broken arm. He said, I couldn't imagine God falling off a mountain bike. He said, I felt this strange sense of being comforted, and I took myself off to bed and slept like a baby. When he said to me he felt a strange sense of being comforted, I knew he'd had a Bible-based experience, because right at the end of Jesus' healing ministry, he said, I'm about to leave you now, but I will pray the Father that he will send you another comforter, and this comforter will stay with you through all time. My brother had never picked up a Bible before in his life, but in a moment of absolute desperation, a willingness to be changed in any way to be out of this terrifying situation, my brother experienced a new view of God in the presence and the power of that comforter, which completely transformed his well-being. My brother, as a Bible student, would be 0 out of 10. If you had a scale of 1 to 10, my brother would be down here on 0 out of 10. Yet right up at the top end of the scale, you'll find people like Mrs. Eddy, who may be 9 or 10 out of 10 on Bible studies. Mrs. Eddy, who'd studied the Bible her whole life, and yet she got a new view of God as well, which completely transformed her well-being. This shows me just how unconditional these laws are. These laws wouldn't care whether you're a 10 out of 10 or a 0 out of 10, or somewhere in the middle. All of these laws, we are living and moving and breathing in them, waiting for us to become conscious of that constant capacity to understand God. Those laws which God wrote in our hearts and our minds, those laws which, because we're made in God's image and likeness, every single man, woman and child in creation must have them. Those laws of God which allow us to tune in, if you like, with a spiritual sense, which is above the 5 material senses. That spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God and his laws. Those laws that allow us to tune in, if you like, to the Christ, the true idea voicing good, the divine message from God to men, speaking to our human consciousness, every man, woman and child in creation. And as I said earlier, that means it doesn't matter which side of a conflict you find yourself. God is speaking to both sides. It doesn't matter which side of an argument or a disagreement, whether it be political or economical or social or religious even. God is on both sides. Just encouraging each one of us to listen to and feel the presence and the power of his laws of comfort, that Christly love, those laws which are written in our hearts and our minds, just waiting for us to become conscious of them. This is the promise of Jesus' healing ministry. This is the promise of the whole Bible, that these laws are ever present. They were promised and prophesied, then produced in the life and times of Jesus. Then Mrs. Eddy discovers them after about 1900 years of being forgotten to the human consciousness. Mrs. Eddy discovered they are still fully operational and fully present. Mrs. Eddy had a remarkable healing for herself, but she didn't stop there. She spent the rest of her life trying to share this information with as many people as possible so that they for themselves can learn to pray this way by quietening the 5 material senses and tuning in, if you like, to what spiritual sense might say. This became a remarkable experience in my own life, but I started to learn through regular church attendance that this wasn't a unique experience. Healings like this are happening all over the world, in Christian Science churches, Christian Science societies, and even when they take it into prison settings. People are learning to pray this way, and the result is healing. We really hope and pray, working for this lecture today, that all the churches and the church members from these societies that have helped put on this event today, all the technical staff working in the background, all of us have been cherishing this for months, hoping and praying that it'll be of some help to you. That if you find yourself in dreadful circumstances, you can lose that sense of dread and go forward with more confidence. If you feel that you're a hopeless case, Christian Science could offer you hope. Even being told you're ill as I was, Christian Science might be able to offer you a cure. Please try this for yourselves. Don't take my word for it. If you don't have a copy of the book, reach out to the contact details that are following shortly. We'll be very happy to get a copy to you. And if you want to find out more about the churches and societies that have sponsored this event, all their contact details are following. We can connect you with church services and reading rooms anywhere close to you if you reach out. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today, and be successful and blessed in whatever you are called to do. Thank you and goodbye.